Thank you. Marina?
I'm the reporting officer for the Section 42A reports on natural features and landscapes and on the coastal environment, which includes the coastal settlements, which is a large spot. So firstly, I'll outline the approach to natural features and landscapes in the proposed plan. As stated in the overview section of my Section 42A report, there are currently no outstanding natural features identified in the operating. The district plan review process identified this gap in a full district-wide landscape assessment was commissioned by the council, which was carried out by John Hudson of Hudson Associates in 2018-2019. Mr. Hudson's assessment considered 4 overall matters: abiotic, biotic, conceptual and associational. Associational includes multicultural values and historic association. Findings of his final report were presented to council in 2019, and this report formed the basis for the creation of a schedule and associated provisions for the draft plan and ultimately in the NFL chapter of the proposed plan. His report also mapped the extent of landscapes and features he identified, and these have been reproduced on the district plan. Mr. Hudson identified 1 outstanding natural landscape, being the Ruahine Range, and 11 natural features. The difference between landscapes and features, as I understand it, is a matter of scale, with features being smaller than landscapes. Mr. Hudson also identified a further 11 natural features that he deemed worthy of recognition for their significant community values, but that did not reach the level of outstanding. All features and landscapes identified were adopted and incorporated in the draft, the ultimately proposed plan, including 12 amenity features, which were termed significant amenity features in the proposed plan. Mr. Hudson is a suitably qualified landscape architect, and I remain satisfied that his assessment methodology adopted best practice and can be relied upon. I draw the panel's attention to the process he carried out, which is outlined in Appendix 1 to his statement, which is appended to my Section 42A report. I also note that there is no alternate expert landscape evidence being presented to the panel as far as I'm aware. I'll just break briefly from my notes just to take the panel briefly through the rules or the provisions that apply to outstanding natural features and landscapes. The proposed plan has 1 rule that relates to buildings on these natural features and landscapes, and there are 2 parts to that rule. 1 covers the majority of the identified ONFs, and then the other part of the rule deals with 4 specific ones, which in discussion with Mr. Hudson were the more vulnerable to effects from buildings. And that's Ngā Kaihinaki Awhata, the Kairako land coastal environment, Parimahu and Parongaho River and Estuary. And the rule has a threshold for permitted activities of 25 square metres gross floor area for a building, or 3 metre height. For the 4 that were identified as being more sensitive, as soon as you go over the 25, it becomes a non-complying activity. For the remaining ONFs, if it's between 25 and 50, it would be restricted discretionary, and over 50 is non-complying. That's just to give you a brief outline of the rule. In terms of the significant amenity features, there's no rules applying to those. 24 parties made a total of 62 original submission points on this topic, and there were 61 further submissions in support or opposition. The 62 original points, 23 of these were in support, with the remainder seeking amendments or opposing various aspects of the provisions in the plan. Submissions opposing various aspects cover a range of matters from minor corrections through to requests to delete various aspects. As a very broad summary, matters of contention include the recognition of farming and existing land uses occurring on land identified as having landscape values and the place of rural character. Recognition of mana whenua aspirations for their whenua, where it has been identified as having landscape values. The existence of a current but unimplemented water storage proposal that has been through a board of inquiry process, being located in an area that has since been identified as an outstanding natural feature, being ONF4 Makaroro Gorge. the adoption of significant amenity features in the plan, the extent of rules applying to land use activities within outstanding natural features and landscapes, the accuracy of the schedule and associated mapping, and the identification of natural features and landscapes where these are over private land. I don't intend to traverse these matters in my opening statement as they have been addressed in my report, along with recommendations in response, some of which were considered by Mr. Hudson and covered in his statement attached to and referenced in my report. However, key aspects of the evidence and legal submissions received in advance of this hearing relate to policy FLP 5 relating to ONF Mark Law Gorge, the significant amenity features and the role of rural character in landscapes. I've read the statements and submissions. I do not have anything further to add at this point in time, but I anticipate returning to these matters in my formal reply following the hearing. I now turn to the coastal environment topic. As stated in my overview section of my report, the coastal environment is only addressed in a cursory way in the operative plan. The coastal environment is identified by a coastal margin line on the planning maps, and the underlying rural zone provisions apply accordingly with differences. Exotic tree planting is limited to 1,000 square metres per site over any 5-year period in the coastal margin area. The gross floor area of buildings is limited to 200 square metres per site in the coastal margin, and all subdivision within the coastal margin of the rural zone is a discretionary activity as opposed to controlled for the rest of the rural zone. The district plan review process identified that coastal environment matters were out of date and particularly needed an overhaul to give effect to the 2010 National Coastal Policy Statement. A review of the extent of the coastal environment and a natural character assessment of the coastal environment was commissioned by the Council, which was carried out by John Hudson of Hudson Associates in 2018 and 2019. Mr. Hudson's assessment covered 3 overall matters: abiotic, biotic and sensory in terms of their condition, i.e. the more pristine, the higher the rating. I note that unlike in landscape assessments, associational matters are not considered in assessing natural character values. I take this opportunity to refer the panel to Mr. Hudson's statement appended to my section 42A report, where he notes that the coastal policy statement requires areas within the coastal environment that have a high natural character or greater to be mapped or otherwise identified. The findings of his report were presented to Council in 2019, and this report formed the basis for the adoption of a revised coastal environment area, adopting the extent as mapped in the Hawke's Bay Regional Coastal Environment Plan. Mr. Hudson did not identify any areas of outstanding natural character in the coastal environment, but did identify 8 coastal sectors with an overall natural character ranking of high or very high. These identified areas were adopted and formed the basis for the creation of a schedule of areas of high natural character and associated provisions for the plan, and ultimately the coastal environment chapter of the proposed plan. His report also mapped the extent of the areas of high natural character he identified. These have been reproduced in the district plan maps. This gives effect to policy 13.1c of the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement. Mr. Hudson is a suitably qualified landscape expert, and I remain satisfied that his assessment methodology adopted best practice and can be relied upon. I draw the panel's attention again to the process he carried out, which is outlined in Exhibit 1 to his statement, which is appended to my report. I also note that there is no alternate expert landscape evidence being presented to the panel at this hearing that I'm aware of. In addition, the Section 42A report covers the coastal settlements. The coastal settlements were contained within the township zone in the operative district plan, alongside the rural townships. The district plan review identified that the coastal settlements had a unique character and amenity that was markedly different to the rural settlements of the district. The rural settlements largely service the rural communities and therefore exhibit more mixed-use environments, including community facilities and some commercial service premises. Conversely, the coastal settlements are almost exclusively residential in nature, largely holiday homes, with few amenities or community facilities and very little commercial activity. For this reason, the coastal settlements have been differentiated in the proposed plan and given a large lot residential zone to reflect their residential character with mostly on-site servicing and associated larger lot sizes. I guess I can just add here that it was hard to find a zone in the national planning standards that really reflected what we were trying to cover with the coastal settlements, and it was quite a large discussion. 15 parties made a total of 77 original submission points on this topic, and there were 34 further submission points. Of the 77 original points, 32 were in support. Matters of contention, as a broad summary: alignment and consistency with the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement, which the RMA requires the district plan to give effect to. The recognition of farming and existing land uses occurring on land identified as exhibiting high natural character values. Rural character versus natural character. Recognition of mana whenua aspirations for the whenua, where it has been identified as having high natural character values. Recognition of activities with an operational functional need to locate within a coastal environment. Addressing public access to and along the coast and over private land. The adoption of areas of high natural character in the proposed plan. The accuracy of the schedule and associated mapping. And zone provisions for the electricity network, emergency service activities, and firefighting, water supply, educational facilities, and camping grounds in the coastal settlements. And these matters have been addressed in my report along with my recommendations, some of which were considered by Mr. Hudson and covered in his statement attached to my report. Key aspects of the evidence and legal submissions received in advance of this hearing relate to the role of rural character in assessing natural character, and a request to include a servicing standard and associated assessment matter to address firefighting, water supply. The latter has been requested across all zones, not just the large lot residential zone. And I just draw attention to our discussion yesterday. I've made contact with fire and emergency planner, and we will work towards having a position on that for perhaps the rural environment hearing. I've read these statements and submissions, and apart from that matter, I do not have anything further to add at this point in time, but anticipate returning to them in my formal reply following the hearing. So to conclude, I anticipate the panel may have additional questions of me following the submitted presentations over the course of today. I note that Mr. Hudson is also available to the panel for questions this afternoon, and I'll provide a formal written reply following adjournment of the hearing.
Are you available for questions now? Okay. Can I just start off then while the panel are getting the thoughts in line? Have you read the statement from Gavin Hyde? I'm trying to find it quickly. I'll just trying to see if you've got any immediate response to his. So there's a large amount of congruence or acceptance of your recommendations, except for Rule Eco 3, Rule 3.
Oh yeah, that's the natural environment. That's
all right, okay.
Vegetation rule.
Happy to respond if that's.
Yes, would you mind? Yeah.
Yes, I have had a look at his submissions. Trying to find one. And I know that his concerns is about the potential for cumulative effects in terms of Eco Rule 3(1)A, which allows currently as phrased provides for 500 square metres or 1%, whichever is the lesser per annum of Indigenous to be uncleared and within an SNA. I think my response, just off the top of my head, my response in my report was, well, firstly, it was never intended that it is an A and B. So the intention is that there's an A or a B. So there's two opportunities there. And I acknowledge that that figure of 500 square metres is an arbitrary figure. There's been a few comments in relation to that, but no one's actually offered an alternative. But I mean, if the panel wishes me to have a closer look at that, I could certainly do that in my right.
And what about the sort of cumulative year by year?
Yeah, so I guess my thoughts on that is that I think there was a clear desire when we were writing these provisions that there is some flexibility in there for farmers in particular. And, looking at the worst case scenario, that could result in some adverse effects. I certainly agree with that. So that maybe there's an opportunity to look at a cap on that, like once every 3 years or every year up to 3 years, and combined with maybe a reduction in the amount, or I don't know, could look at a number of those things if there was a interest in me doing that.
So I don't think he offered a solution.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. No one's actually offered any solutions.
This is another one of those topics that it could be worthwhile having an offline conversation, trying to find some sort of acceptable.
I guess the difficulty I have is that on one side we've got the regional council and forest and birds saying those are too loose, and on the other side we've got federated farmers who, if they're not part of that conversation, if we come back with something that's tighter, they're going to go, well, we never had a chance to look at that. So I guess it's just how do we manage that balance?
Well, I don't know about hot tubbing. Maybe it's just something worthwhile, and you write a reply. As no one else has offered a solution to that and other alternatives, we kind of like left something in the dark, really.
Yes.
So maybe through write a reply, propose something we can consider. Unless you
Around the cumulative?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
The option, as Commissioner Lovell thinks, to if there's something more require some conferencing. What are your thoughts around that?
No one's done that. I would look to our lawyer to help us with that.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly having those conversations before the hearing on the matters where there was some agreement was helpful, but where there's disagreement, I don't. Yeah.
I know it may result in no agreement.
Yeah.
Or narrowing of the issues.
Yeah.
But it might be worthwhile at the early stage in the hearing process to try.
Yeah.
How many parties are we talking about? You know?
Three. I'd have to go back and have a look, but it would definitely be from Election 5, Third, Regional Council and Federated Farmers. There may be a few others in there as well. I'm not sure.
Just make sure that it's a planning point.
Planning
You don't want everybody jumping in.
Yeah.
We'll have a
We
conversation.
can have a conversation about it if you think.
Forestry companies, but I don't think they submitted on that particular point. Yeah, but I can, in my right of reply, if it was helpful to you, I can identify the parties and I can identify sort of an option that you might like to consider, and then take it from there. Would that be helpful?
Yeah. Helen?
Just a point of clarification, would the expert conferencing be expected to occur before the right of reply, or?
Well, it depends on how many people
Oh,
are
yeah,
involved,
okay.
to be honest.
I'm just thinking of
days.
time requirements.
Yeah, you've only got 10
Yeah.
days, so I'd be surprised if it was before.
I think it would be logistically challenging.
Yeah, and we can waive the 10-day
Yeah.
limit for the right of reply on that matter, if it looks like it would be productive.
I think it might be, but
Oh, okay. I was thinking about it differently, but yeah.
But I know there's another bunch of hearings very shortly.
End of
So,
March.
yeah. Well, we'll have a think about it.
I mean, also at the end of the day, we've got all of those parties, or the three that you've talked about coming today. We can raise it with each of them and see what they say. If we get pushed back, then potentially it's not the option for us. But we can at least ask and see, because it possibly won't be the only time that we want them to do this. So getting it started now. But we can ask. At the end of the day, these are people who have done these things, so they shouldn't be sued by it.
And the other question is, do we confine it to the cumulative effects issue or
We could do.
otherwise?
I mean, we can issue a direction in terms of the questions we have, and confine it to that.
I'll wait for a little bit more further direction from you. Okay, thank you.
So, any questions from the panel for Lorraine?
So a number of submitters have referred to the significant amenity features and also reference to other councils removing reference to the SAFs. What effect would that have in this PDP if they were to be taken out?
From a pure plan provisions perspective, not a lot. They are referred to, they are scheduled, and they are mapped, and that's about it. I think from probably a question more from Mr. Hudson about whether he thinks that would be appropriate or not. I guess some of those significant amenity features are possibly landscapes that have significant values, landscape values, that if you didn't identify them and they got addressed just as any other rural landscape, that I think there is value in having them identified, just for awareness, if anything, and also if a consent is considered in the process, it allows the decision makers to consider those values as being a little bit more than just the average rural landscape. So practically not a lot of difference, but I think from a landscape values perspective, I think they offer some value in being retained. But that's a good question for Mr. Hudson, I think. Okay, thank you.
So they would, sorry to pick up on that. So they would only be relevant, say, if there was a discretionary or non-complying activity consent that enabled it to be considered. And that's similarly the case with the
High natural
high
character.
natural.
Yes. There are parts of the plan for the HNC areas where they probably the subdivision chapter, I think if there's a subdivision in the high natural character area, it might trigger slightly differently, I think, in my head. But for most part, it's about assessment matters that can come at a resource consent stage. For whatever reason, discretionary non-complying is triggered, then those matters come into play. They don't trigger the consent themselves.
And what about the role of forestry in terms of the character of those areas? Was that considered in terms of whether they will not?
Yes, and the National Environment Standard for Plantation Forestry, I think if it's an outstanding natural feature or landscape, it's a restricted discretionary activity, forestation or clearing.
Right, but
So
that,
they cut that, we left it to
yeah.
that.
not to high natural character.
Well, no, because coast natural character is not covered in the NSPF. And I think there was a bit of discussion around the high natural character areas and exotic plantation forestry and the impact that has on landscape values. And I think that's covered in Mr. Hudson's assessments, where those those apply, and there was some discussion around the balancing of where people might be wanting to plant for soil erosion reasons and how that could impact on their SAP values. But it was decided that we wouldn't regulate that aspect.
And was that sort of considered as, because there's quite a bit of debate about what rural activities are. And in my mind, whether that was including forestry or excluding forestry.
So I guess from definition of primary production activity would include forestry. So yes, so there's that's an interesting conversation, I guess, with Mr. Hudson around the impact of that on values is possibly different to continuation of pastoral farming on a landscape, I guess.
Thank you. Questions?
Just following on from that one, just looking at the ONFs, if there is existing plantation forestry on a proposed ONF, what is the onus on the landowner there, or what's the process for? Is that if it goes through?
So if there is existing plantation forestry, that's fine, it can stay there. There's no requirement to remove it or anything like that as a result of being identified as an outstanding natural feature. But I guess if they were looking to clear it or to replant, the NESPF provisions would kick in again, and they would need a restricted discretionary activity from the council for that.
Just to follow on, perhaps just to, were we to retain financial features and all those sort of things. Hawke's Regional Council in their submission, and I'll raise it with them, note that approximately 90% of original native vegetation has been lost in the Central Hawke's Bay district. Would you concur with that? So that's something we could be considered retaining.
That's probably best for Stella, a question for Stella.
Could you repeat the question?
The comment in the the Regional Council's submission is that the historical loss of indigenous biodiversity, I was tongue twisted on that, is staggering. For example, approximately 90% of original native vegetation has been lost in Central Hawke's Bay.
I think Mr. Kessels can confirm that, but that's certainly indicated in his reports. The threatened classification is exceptionally high in Central Hawke's Bay.
And possibly just following on, Forest and Bird in their legal opinion, and this probably is again for you, Stella, at paragraph 41, they reference that rules, of course, in terms of the district plan need to comply with the regional plan. Of course, this opinion is relating to the Makaruru. I just wondered, you probably looked at the regional plan far better than I have. Is there anything in the regional plan currently that would relate to freshwater and water storage? You know, I mean, they've just made the statement that said you've got to comply with the regional plan. They haven't actually told us what in the regional plan is relevant. I'm just wondering.
In terms of, particularly in terms of water storage.
Well, that's what this legal opinion is largely about. So it's paragraph 41 of their legal opinion that we got yesterday.
So that to do with the landscape?
No, it's more in terms of Stella, in terms of ONLs and the Makaroto.
So no, that's.
That landscape.
That's landscape.
Oh, okay.
Are we talking landscapes or significant Indigenous features?
Outstanding natural feature, character, features and landscape. Sorry, yes, it is you, Rhonda.
Sorry to confuse everybody.
That's all right.
So whether there's anything in the regional plan, I will have to check that.
Okay. Because they haven't said what.
Yes, I know that there is a section in the RPS about outstanding natural features and landscapes, but there's nothing been identified. There are no ONFs or RNLs in the regional plan.
Yeah, and I just note that because of course they go into King Salmon in part 2 and being able to kick up
So
above.
that assessment hasn't been done from a
No.
regional perspective.
No,
I'm
but
fairly confident.
if you could just check,
Yep,
because
I will double check.
I never like loose ends where they don't actually tell us.
Mr. Ide will, assist you with that as well.
Yeah.
I will.
And probably just to follow that on, in your report, and yes, I have main paragraphs because it's easier for me. 4.319.19
Of my coastal or my landscape?
landscape. I haven't even got to coastal yet. And in that, you're talking about Mr. Eagles again in paragraph 4. And this whole conversation that we were having actually about classification, determined first, and then the mechanisms are subsequent. Given you would have heard my conversation with legal counsel yesterday about the Man of War case. Have you had any thoughts in terms of any concerns you would have in terms of the Makaroto? Oh, actually, it might be Stella. I'm almost treating you like twins, but yeah.
That's right. Sorry, can you send me to which paragraph, sorry, again?
No, it might be more Stella, to be honest. Leave that one. But I think I have to think about it a little bit more. Maybe we could go to. I started having some questions around the farming activities. 4.3.12 in your report. We would say there is no intent to prevent existing legally established farming activities from continuing. I guess the devil's in the detail when you say legally established. Are you meaning legally established now, legally established after?
Well, if they're existing, presumably they were established legally. Yeah. I guess that was really just to recognise that there are situations where things might have been done that wouldn't be.
In terms of 4.31.15, again, it's around farming land use. You say the intent is not to regulate farming use within the identified landscape, but to focus on addressing specific activities. And I note that you've identified a few here. I just sort of wondered, would you not say that there are activities that are regulated farm use that would still have to be regulated in terms of this paragraph? So I'm possibly not being clear. I mean, you said on one hand that you're not planning on regulating farmland use, but you're going to be regulating activities. Aren't a number of those activities actually farm use?
I guess perhaps to be clear, the regulation that's being proposed in the proposed plan is around buildings. Whether it's for a farming activity or any other type of activity is actually not the focus. The focus is the building and the impact of the building on the landscape values. So I guess that could be a farm shed or it could be a house.
Okay. And then just to follow on a conversation I had with Stella yesterday, in 5.2.4, 5.3.7 and various others that I've got here, it's discussing that whole point about Ngāti Kere and their concern about development on Māori land. And I think, is it 5 point? So it's probably 5.38.8. Just a note again, an observation that not all Māori development is public hire housing and all of those sort of things. So when I look at 5.3.8, that is, I sort of think, well, that's one aspect, but it's probably not all in terms of what Ngāti Kere are saying in terms of their submission. So something to be mindful of, that we're not just dropping into the public hire PKH chapter.
Maybe if I can just elucidate a little bit, the Papakainga PKH chapter is actually the Papakainga Kaumatua Housing and Marae Development chapter. So it actually extends beyond just Papakainga development in that respect. So
Social Māori housing, then let's put it that way. In terms of that.
Marae development we're considered includes commercial and other aspects as well. That chapter is actually quite broad.
I'd have to have a look at it, but I would suspect that Māori commercial development was probably not necessarily connected to Marae development, but noted. And then finally, just in terms of 7.34, what other councils have included provisions for amenity landscapes in their district plans?
Or
7 points.
significant amenity features.
So a number of district councils throughout New Zealand have included provisions for amenity landscapes or similar in their district plans.
Hastings have.
Yeah.
Top of my head, I'd have to have a look at that, but I know there are a few. I can find those out for you.
Be lovely. And you're aware, of course, that we've had submissions to the reverse that happened. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I guess probably my one response to that is that some councils, when they've applied their significant amenity features or landscapes, have also attached regulatory mechanisms to those. That's not the case in the Central Hawke's Bay proposed plan. We purposely did not apply rules to those.
Okay. Can you give us examples of where the rules where the other approach has been taken, so we can at least have them before us? We can consider any decision.
There's some in the Federated Farmers evidence.
I like to get the.
Yep, so I can.
If nothing else, it's because when we get to the point of making a decision, if we've got it before us and we've asked you for it, then we can consider it. We may not use it, but at least we've asked you for it versus coming to the end and going, we should have asked. And just because I don't really have anything more on either of those books, we've had requests for further information or further clarification in these reports. I haven't gone through to list them. Given we are going to be speaking to some of these submitters, are there any ones in particular that you would like us to follow up or ask or anything for?
Not in particular. It was really just giving them the opportunity. If they wanted to expand on their submission and explain a bit more, then I was, I guess, offering to have the ability to reconsider if they would want to add further. So I think
Just if you had something burning that you wanted to ask.
burning questions. No burning questions.
No, that's fine. That's all right. Thank you.
Yes, I'm just aware of the time. We're due to hear from Steve Deckard soon, but just a final, I don't know, just a comment maybe or response to Mr. Kay's statement around the issue between natural and rural character, because you're recommending adding rural into that objective. And he's suggesting that rural character could lead to conflicts between activities that may be consistent with rural character and those that would be inconsistent with preserving or restoring natural character. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
I would like to reply to that in my right of reply.
Okay.
I may Hudson about.
Right, yeah. That raised an interesting question. Thank you. Any further questions from the panel?
Confirming, Mr. Chairman, will we be coming back to this?
Yeah, I was going to cover that. When are Mr. Hudson and Mr. Kessel's available?
They're available between 2:30 and 3:30 this afternoon.
Okay, so after this one, right. And you'd be there to answer questions that may come off those questions there. So 2:30. Any other questions from the panel? Okay, well, good timing then. Is Mr. Pickard? No, sorry, Pickard. Sorry, my apologies. Is it on? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Time for another question.
Yeah.
Rowena.
Yes, for Rowena. So 4.3.9, George Harper was talking about requesting or talking about protecting integrity of the skyline. So is there a precedent for that? I'm thinking Tomato Peak is one, but
That's, I think, I guess with that particular submission, it was possibly difficult to determine what skyline it was referencing, whether it was all skylines or part of the skyline. Skyline, I don't think has been adopted in Hastings, other than there is a contour on the Tomato Peak building line restriction. Yeah, it's not been recommended by Mr. Hudson, so I guess the outstanding natural features and landscapes that he's identified, maybe the Rohini Ranges is possibly a skyline that you would consider.
I was thinking about I'll ask later the Ngā Tipuna project has highlighted a lot of the past sites and things that are and one of which is in the ONF in Takapo, that where it's a defined thing that you look at.
Yes.
Yeah. My other question relates to the Te Aoti limestone crest and the Wakarara range, of which where Central Hawke's Bay only has a portion of those. What is happening so for example, Te Aoti limestone crest, 7 kilometres of the 27 kilometres of that crest are in CHB. What's happening on the other side? Are they looking at this?
That would be a really good question for Mr. Hudson. My understanding was that when he did his assessment, he looked beyond, and I think he tried to line up. So I think they follow through into the Hastings district.
Okay, yeah. There's a continuation of that, so
It might be called something different.
Sylvia, I've got another one if you want me to keep going.
he's not on yet, and I haven't heard from him.
6.3.8 regarding I think it was in front of me the issue. Why the Tuki water storage project further submission talked about having Te Mana o Te Wai and community health at the top of their hierarchy of needs, and yet the word the environmental benefits are not mentioned anywhere in terms of downstream of this. Is that why are the words environmental benefits not used in terms of downstream benefits of water storage in this?
Good question. I think possibly in that policy we weren't considering the environmental benefits, the landscape values quite purely at that point. So it was about that.
Just following on from that, do you have a perspective about if we were to put environmental in that policy and retain it, if there would be any concerns from a planning perspective?
I would need to think about that.
Just one clarification, and I apologise if I have missed this somewhere else. You mentioned in your summary or your opening statement that the under the ONFs and ONLs and whatnot, that there was one rule, the majority was under one rule and 4 specific ones were under the second, of which you said Karako Coastal, Parimahu, Parongaho Foreshore Estuary, and I missed what the other one was, the 4 that are specific. It had Whasa in it, but I missed which, there's 2 of them.
Karako, take.
Is it the Takapai one or the?
Yes, yes, Te Kaihina Kia Whata and Te Whata Pokapo.
Yeah, the two separate ones.
I think, is it the 3 sisters is in there, in that part of the.
Thank you.
No. He might be late. Wrong one.
We've disabled comments, so we can't actually see if
He's not in there.
Would you like me to write them?
Or just, is it okay if I just ring him?
Yeah. Or if we don't pass.
That's quite a nice sort of basket. Skyline one. Is it? I'm pretty sure that Sugarloaf you keep up with that's a building one. But you can't, Sugarloaf and Taradale, you can't build above a certain height. And the Mata Peaks, but Mata Peaks obviously got one part of the supervision. Like really locally known as Blackhead. It's the informal version is places for the Blackheads.
I live in Whiteman's Valley, dear. Nothing but sun.
Parimahu is the outline of a head.
I remember. You showed me.
Out there. And so that should.
Head all on that is a problem.
Yeah.
It's no, it's not down on the like that. Sort of pimple.
Got a beauty spot.
That's very.
Oh, no, because it's in this.
Not feeling a wedding.
I like that.
Keep going.
Start video.
Sorry about that. Clint, are you able to hear us okay?
I'll just unmute him.
Sorry about that. Clint, are you able to hear us okay?
Yes, I can.
Oh, I think it's very quiet.
You can hear me? Yes, I can.
No, we can't hear you at the moment. Clint,
One moment, I'll just get William back.
okay. One moment. Can't hear you at the moment.
One moment, I'll just get William back.
Okay.
And can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Yeah. We can lip read.
Can you translate for us?
Yeah.
Sign.
Sorry. William, sorry, that. I can say.
Yesterday went too smoothly.
Yeah. You didn't say the beginning. No. So now we can't seem to hear him.
Can you hear me now? No. Hello, hello, hello.
We hear us, but we can't hear him.
You know, I know. I just tested the speaker and nothing came through.
Just pause the recording.
You know, I know. I just tested the speaker and
Clint, we can hear you on the internet, so it is at their end.
Right. Okay.
nothing. Other ones?
Can you hear us, Clint?
Yes, I can. Loud and
Do
clear.
you mean, can somebody else?
Someone actually
Can Bridget hear?
Yes, I
Bridget's
can.
fine.
Hello, hello, hello. 1, 2, 3. How are you going?
You want to just let them know?
How do we do that?
Just, I think you can do them.
All right, if you can hear me, sorry, we're having some significant sound issues, so bear with us, please, and we're trying to sort it out as soon as we can. Thank you.
It's very small.